Hey guys, how's it going? TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to part 2 of our next Vice Presidential Series installment as we're taking a look at the 19th Vice President of the United States, William A. Wheeler. I hope you enjoyed part 1 yesterday as we took a look, of course, at the early life and the early political rise and political career of William Wheeler. And now we're going to be taking a look at his vice presidency and his legacy and his death here in part 2. Of course, I am flying solo, so for the audio portion. So I will get right into it. Let's jump right in to this part 2, looking at William A. Wheeler. A quiet candidate. At the Republican convention in Cincinnati, William Wheeler received a handful of votes for president, but the major contest was between Senator Conklin, House Speaker Blaine, and Governor Hayes. When Conklin's nomination seemed impossible, his party machine, the Stalwarts, threw their support to Hayes as the best way of stopping Blaine, leader of the half-breed faction. Having helped Hayes win the presidential nomination, the Stalwarts considered the vice presidency theirs to name, and they put forward New York Representative Stewart Woodford. The half-breeds, however, wanted the Stalwarts off the ticket. Massachusetts half-breed Senator George F. Hoyer promoted his friend Wheeler as a man of high moral character. Hoyer approached the distinguished author James Russell Lowell, a member of the Massachusetts delegation, on Wheeler's behalf. When Lowell replied that he was unwilling to vote for anyone about whom he knew so little, Hoyer responded, "Mr. Lowell, Mr. Wheeler is a very sensible man. He knows the Bigelow Papers by heart." Lowell, the author of the Bigelow Papers, said nothing but later was overheard telling other delegates, "I understand that Mr. Wheeler is a very sensible man." Former Vermont Senator and Representative Luke Poland placed Wheeler's name in nomination, while Conklin's lieutenant Tom Platt nominated Woodford. The publicity Wheeler had received for his compromise, coupled with his independence from the Conkling machine, appealed to the delegates, who voted for him overwhelmingly. When the roll call of the states reached New York, the Stalwarts realized they were about to lose and withdrew Woodford's name. The New York delegation voted unanimously for Wheeler, a bitter pill for Conklin's supporters to swallow. During the campaign, Democrats vainly sought scandals in the past of the Republican candidates, but could find nothing that would tar Wheeler's reputation. One campaign biography boasted that, at the time when it was fashionable for congressmen to dabble in railroad stocks and bonds, Wheeler had neither bought nor sold a share of stock or a single bond in any Pacific Railroad. He had served his country in Congress for 10 years without adding to the personal wealth that he brought to Washington. With simple tastes, his biographer extolled, he has never been greedy of gain either for its own sake or for the luxury it would buy. As a legislator, the thought never occurred to him that his influence could bring riches, and not the shadow of a stain rests on his name. Wheeler had also voted against the salary grab, an unpopular attempt by members of Congress to raise their pay retroactively, and refused the increase in his own salary. Wheeler also appealed to the professional songwriters, who in 1876 were just taking over the business of writing campaign songs from the amateurs who had long prevailed. The Tin Pan Alley Men leaned towards puns, alliteration, and other word plays in their songs. Thus, the sheet music for "We'll Go for Hayes, Will Wheeler on time" showed Wheeler pushing Hayes in a wheelbarrow toward the White House. While William Wheeler did not detract from the ticket, he had little to it, and he even refused to campaign. The Democratic vice presidential nominee, Thomas Hendricks, spoke in the swing state of Indiana, but Wheeler declined all invitations from the Republicans. In a remarkable reply to James G. Blaine's invitation to speak to a series of mass meetings in Maine, Wheeler cited his frailty and insomnia as excuses. "I greatly regret my physical inability to do little in the way of speaking in his canvass, but I have no reserve of strength to draw upon. I was driven from business in 1865 by broken health and have never been strong since. My trouble for years has been wakefulness at night. No resident of the grave or a lunatic asylum has suffered more from this cause than I have. Speaking and the presence of crowds excite me and intensify my wakefulness. Governor Hayes wrote me asking me to go to Indiana and Ohio, to which I answered as I write you, I regret that I was nominated. You know I did not want the place. I should have gone back to the House and into a Republican majority. I should have almost, to a certainty, been its Speaker, which I would greatly prefer to being laid away." All that Wheeler would do was to issue the traditional letter of acceptance of his nomination. The conciliatory tone of that letter toward the South was seen as part of the Republican strategy of trying to detach the old Southern Whigs from the Southern Democrats. Candidate Hayes issued a similarly ambiguous endorsement of reconciliation with the South. At the Republican convention, the civil rights leader Frederick Douglass had challenged the delegates to decide whether they meant to uphold for blacks the rights they had written into the Constitution or whether they could get along without the vote of the black man in the South. The Hayes and Wheeler ticket suggested that the party had chosen the latter course. So, of course, that leads us to the election of 1876, probably the most contested election in our country's history. It was definitely one of the most contentious presidential elections in American history. And basically, the resolution involved negotiations and compromise between the Republicans and Democrats. The election was, of course, the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, and his running mate was William A. Wheeler, and they went up against the Democratic nominee, who was Samuel J. Tilden of New York, and his running mate, Thomas A. Hendricks. The electoral vote was 185 to 184. States carried. Hayes won 21, Tilden won 17. Now, here's an interesting part. The popular vote, it actually was 50.9% to Tilden, where Hayes and Wheeler only got 47.9%. It was 4,034,000 and change for Hayes and Wheeler, opposed to 4,286,000 and change for Tilden and Hendricks, as far as the popular vote went. This was a very, very, very suspicious, contested election. Very interesting. Hayes and Wheeler did win, and that obviously did go down that way, but very, very interesting and very suspicious, so to speak. I'm sure you're seeing some maps and that sort of thing. And now I'm going to get into the actual contested election itself. So Here we go. The contested election. On election night, it looked as if Tilden and Hendricks had defeated Hayes and Wheeler, especially after Democrats captured Wheeler's home state of New York. Republican newspapers conceded the election, but ZACHARIAH Chandler, chairman of the Republican National Committee, saw hope in the Southern electors and dispatched telegrams to party leaders in those Southern states still under Reconstruction rule, alerting them that the election was still undecided. 3 Southern states each sent 2 sets of electoral ballots, 1 set for Tilden and 1 set for Hayes. One of the disputed states was Louisiana, where only a year earlier, WilliamAWheeler had found evidence that the State Board of Election had produced fraudulent returns. Now his election as vice president depended upon that same board. After a specially created electoral commission awarded all of the disputed ballots to Hayes, a joint session of Congress still had to count the ballots. And there was talk of angry Democrats marching on Washington by the thousands to prevent this steal of the election. Any of this sound familiar, by the way, folks? To avoid bloodshed, friends of both candidates met at the Warmly Hotel in Washington in late February of 1877. There they agreed to a compromise that settled the election and ended Reconstruction. In return for Hayes' election, Republicans offered federal funds to build railroads through the ravaged South and otherwise restore the Southern economy, promised to appoint a Southerner to the cabinet, and most important, pledged to remove all federal troops from the Southern states. When members of the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives still tried to block the counting of the electoral ballots, a Louisiana representative assured them that an acceptable arrangement had been negotiated at the Warmly Hotel. The revolt fizzled, and at 4 a.m. on March 2nd, senators marched to the House chamber to declare Hayes president. Hayes upheld the bargain and removed the federal troops, abandoning black voters to disfranchisement and segregation. The crazy election of 1876. Definitely go Google that for yourself. Crazy stuff was happening there. Yeah, pretty crazy. You know, people that talk about the election in 2020, you know, obviously that took place in November of 2020 between the incumbent Donald Trump and our president currently, Joe Biden. You know, a lot of people say that that was fishy and that was contested. It was nothing like 1876, I can assure you. So go read about it. So here we go, moving on. Hymn singing and square talk. Although they had not known each other before their nomination, Rutherford B. Hayes and WilliamAWheeler developed an unusually friendly relationship while in office. The Hayes family, scorned by many Washington politicos for their old-fashioned manner and strict adherence to temperance, became a surrogate family to the lonely vice president, a 60-year-old widower with no children. The vice president was fond of hymn singing, and each Sunday evening, the Hayes family invited Wheeler and a few other friends to the White House Library, where Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz played the piano and the vice president distributed copies of the Presbyterian hymn and tune book for a revelry of sweet sounds and mingling of souls. Wheeler also provided Hayes with advice about appointments, recommending that selections be made according to personal character, recognized capacity, and experience. He especially warned Hayes about the hostility that the Conkling machine exhibited toward the new administration. At one point, Hayes noted in his diary that William Wheeler was critical of cabinet members who, when approached by job seekers, responded equivocally, "When there is no hope, tell the man so," Wheeler asserted. "He will be disappointed at the time, but it is the best way." Hayes observed that Wheeler was right. Prompt and square talk is in the long run safest and is just to the parties concerned. I must also bear this in mind. Despite their friendship, Hayes rarely consulted Wheeler and did not include him within his circle of advisors. William Wheeler spent his vice presidency presiding over Senate debates, a job he found dull and monotonous, comparing his role of repeating set phrases to that of a parrot. During his term, he cast 6 tie-breaking votes, including one that helped his own friend William Pitt Kellogg to be seated as senator from Louisiana. Wheeler grew particularly frustrated at being left out of both cabinet meetings and party caucuses and feeling that he was generally ignored. "The greatest trial of being vice president," he once commented, "was attending church. I hear the minister praying for the president, his cabinet, both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, the governors and legislatures of all the states, and every individual heathen, and find myself wholly left out." A forgotten man. Wheeler made it easy for his nation to forget that he existed. A more assertive man might have risen to lead the opposition to the Conkling machine, but William Wheeler contented himself with sneering at Conkling rather than challenging him. The vice president urged President Hayes not to appear weak in yielding to Conkling. But when Hayes took on Conkling by removing his lieutenants Chester A. Arthur and Alonzo Cornell from their lucrative posts at the New York Custom House, Wheeler disapproved the action because he feared it might split the party. Wheeler even endorsed Cornell's candidacy for governor of New York. In December of 1879, the Republican National Committee met in Washington as a first step toward nominating the presidential ticket for 1880. Hayes had let it be known that he would not stand for a second term, and sentiments within the party seemed to be roughly divided between Grant and Blaine. In his diary, Hayes commented, "If New York could with a fair degree of unity present a man like, say, the vice president, he would probably be nominated." But there was no hope of the factions in New York uniting, especially over someone who opposed Roscoe Conkling. At the convention, James A. Garfield defeated Grant, Blaine, and other candidates on the 36th ballot to become the Republican nominee. He and his running mate, Chester A. Arthur, went on to win the election. In March of 1881, William Wheeler turned over the vice presidency to his successor, Conkling's Confederate Chester Arthur, Chet Arthur, as he was known. Within months, Conkling launched his last great political battle against the new president. In May, both New York Senators Conkling and Tom Platt dramatically resigned and returned to Albany, where they expected the state legislature to re-elect them as a sign of solidarity in their patronage struggles with Garfield. Instead, the legislature rebelled. a number of candidates entered the Senate race, including former Vice President Wheeler. On several ballots, Wheeler ran ahead of Conkling. Although neither won the election, Conkling's biographer concluded that the ambition of former Vice President Wheeler was a major contributing cause to Conkling's defeat. Crushed by his defeat and by Garfield's assassination, Conkling retired from politics to a lucrative Wall Street law practice. William A. Wheeler also retired from public life, turning down an appointment from President Chester Arthur to serve on a commission to study the tariff because, he said, his health was not up to it. William A. Wheeler died on June 4th of 1887 in Malone, New York, a forgotten man. William A. Wheeler. Interesting. He's an interesting figure because he's so obscure. It's truly amazing about him. It really is. I told you about the election of 1876. They nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. It was actually on the 7th ballot that he was nominated at the Republican National Convention. Wheeler was considered a safe choice for the vice presidential nominee, as he had not made many enemies over the course of his political career. And that's kind of why he was chosen. Of course, there's that famous quote that Rutherford B. Hayes wrote to his wife, Lucy, I am ashamed to say, who is Wheeler? Hayes and Wheeler had not served in the House of Representatives at the same time, so Hayes was really unfamiliar with his running mate. And then, of course, Wheeler's vice presidency. William Wheeler was inaugurated on March 4th of 1877, and he served until March 4th of 1881. Since William Wheeler was a recent widower, his wife having died 1 year before he took office, he was a frequent guest at the White House and the White House's alcohol-free luncheons. As vice president, Wheeler presided over the Senate. According to Rutherford B. Hayes, William Wheeler was one of the few vice presidents who were on cordial terms, intimate and friendly with the president. Our family were heartily fond of him, Hayes wrote. Hayes had announced at the start of his administration that he would not run for a second term, and Wheeler did not run for the 1880 Republican presidential nomination and retired at the end of his term. We know all that, of course. I kind of went over that with you guys. During the campaign, Democrats tried to find anything that campaign of 1876 to discredit Hayes or Wheeler, but they found nothing. After the closest and most disputed presidential election in the U.S. has ever seen, Hayes and Wheeler won. Hayes promised to serve only one term. Wheeler did the same. Wheeler's wife died a year before he began his term. So to avoid loneliness, he spent a lot of time at the White House, becoming good friends with President and Mrs. Hayes. While vice president, he felt ignored, being left out of cabinet and policy meetings. And after his term, he retired back to private life in Malone, New York. A little bit more about his retirement. In January of 1881, Wheeler received 10 votes in the New York State Legislature's Republican caucus to determine a nominee for the U.S. Senate seat held by Democrat Francis Kernan. The Republican nomination went to Thomas C. Platt, who received 54 caucus votes. The Republicans controlled the legislature, and Platt defeated Kernan 104 votes to 50. Wheeler retired to Malone, New York, following the end of his vice presidential term on March 4th of 1881. In May of 1881, Platt and Roscoe Conkling resigned their U.S. Senate seats in a dispute with President James A. Garfield over control of patronage in New York, triggering two special elections. In the legislative election for Platt's seat, it took 6 weeks of balloting to elect a candidate. Wheeler's name was in consideration, and he received as many as 23 votes before Warner Miller was elected with 76 votes on the 46th ballot. Wheeler was also a candidate for Conkling seat. The voting went on for several weeks, and Wheeler received as many as 50 votes on some ballots before Elbridge G. Lapham won with 92 votes on the 56th ballot. William Wheeler died of natural causes at his home in Malone, New York at 10:10 a.m. on Saturday, June 4th of 1887. The funeral was held at the Congregational Church in Malone. He was interred next to his wife in Malone's Morningside Cemetery on June 7th of 1887. It's pretty incredible about William Wheeler. He had integrity. He was probably one of the most honest politicians in the history of our country. He was modest. He was thoughtful. He was probably the most obscure vice presidential nominee ever. He was a big-time advocate of civil rights. He was low-key. He did more listening than he did speaking. You know, when he did speak, he had impact. He made an impact. He got along with everyone, but he was not easily influenced. He was just a really morally sound person. I even touched on this earlier. He turned down taxpayer money to pay for a post office in Malone, New York, his hometown, and he turned it down because he didn't want anybody to consider it special treatment for himself. Truly incredible. It really is when you really look at his life and how obscure he really was and how forgotten he really is. It's incredible. He is buried at the Morningside Cemetery in Malone, New York. I'm going to show you a couple pictures here, and then I'll show you some pictures at the end during bonus footage. So not only do you see the pictures of his grave site, I'm also going to show you some pictures of the sign outside of his home in Malone, New York. You can take a look at those as well. I did not visit those. Those pictures of the home are not mine. Those are stock photos I've found online. And also just showing you a picture here of, I believe this is the Congregational Church where William Wheeler's funeral was held in Malone, New York. Now, the Congregational Church that's on that spot now was built in 1883. That's the current First Congregational Church building. It's the third church building of this congregation on this spot. That's what I basically found. Built on the foundation of the previous building, one of the small tunnels built in the basement to secret fugitive slaves is still intact. U.S. President William Wheeler was a prominent member of the congregation and contributed several features on the interior of the church, including a stained glass window in honor of his wife's parents and the marble cenotaph in honor of Reverend Ashbel Parmalee, the congregation's first minister. So, I believe that the pictures you're seeing here, it was one of those two buildings that his funeral was held at. I'm pretty sure it's the second one, the one that says the Red Brick Church, but I am not 100% sure on the factual nature of that, but I'm pretty sure from the research I did. So that's all in Malone, New York, the house, the church. I did not see those. Those are pictures I found online. I'm going to show you my pictures of his gravesite and my visit to his gravesite in bonus footage here in a second. But I want to leave you with this. Our 19th Vice President of the United States, I read this in part one, but I want to read it again because it is an absolute fabulous, wonderful, tremendous quote from our 19th Vice President. And I want to leave you guys with this. One last thing. So I will say this. Thank you so much. You guys are the best. I appreciate everything you do. Please keep all those comments and questions coming. Please keep doing everything you do. We love the comments and questions. We cannot thank you guys enough for all that you guys do. You truly are the best audience on YouTube, and we really, really cannot thank you enough. So, with that said, I leave you with this wonderful quote from our 19th Vice President, William A. Wheeler. We owe it to the cause of universal civil liberty. We owe it to the struggling liberalism of the old world that every man of whatever race or color or however poor, helpless or lowly he may be, in virtue of his manhood, is entitled to the full employment of every right appertaining to the most exalted citizenship. William Allman Wheeler. Hey guys, how's it going? TJ back with you. The reason that I'm actually recording this audio real quick for you guys is because I found two really very cool things that I found afterwards that I wanted to read to you. There was a book written about William Allman Wheeler. The author's name was Herbert C. Hallis. He was a professor, historian, author, but you're seeing a picture, I'm sure, of the book cover here on your screen. He wrote a book. Unfortunately, Mr. Hallis died back in like 2019, a couple of years ago, because I thought I was going to maybe try to contact him and interview him for a few minutes for bonus footage, but he's passed away, unfortunately. So, but I found an incredible article that is from December of 2013 that he wrote for like the Adirondack Almanac. I don't know if it's a paper or a newsletter, but he wrote a really cool story about William Wheeler that I wanted to read to you guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read that story. I'm going to show you a couple just basic pictures on your screen, and then I'm going to read you one other thing that I found that I really liked. And while I'm reading that other thing, you're going to be taking a look at my photos of the gravesite of William Wheeler as, you know, I'm reading it. So this is my bonus footage for William Wheeler. Enjoy this story, and then, of course, enjoy the photos of my visit to the Morningside Cemetery, in Malone, New York, where our 19th Vice President, William A. Wheeler, is laid to rest, with not only, him himself, but his wife is there, his wife Mary King Wheeler, and his parents are even there, Allman Wheeler and Eliza Wheeler. So the whole Wheeler family is there. So enjoy my photos of my visit, and here we go with this story. 1878. The Vice President and the First Lady go fishing. News in 1878 that Vice President William Allman Wheeler of Malone, a recent widower, would be taking First Lady Lucy Hayes fishing in the Adirondacks without her husband gave New Yorkers something else to talk about besides President Rutherford B. Hayes' latest feud with New York's U.S. Senator Roscoe Conkling. Wheeler had been disappearing into the Adirondacks to fish since he was a poor boy growing up in Malone, the county seat for Franklin County, located on the Canadian border. By the time he became a lawyer, state legislator, bank executive, and railroad president, his annual fishing trips became newsworthy. As early as 1864, newspapers reported that Wheeler was heading into the South Woods, or the Great Southern Wilderness, with a group of his political and business friends for a week of fishing. He called his fishing party the Saranac Navigation Company. often staying at Martin's Hotel on Lower Saranac Lake or Bartlett's Hotel on the carry between Middle and Upper Saranac Lakes. They would compete for an imaginary championship belt, which would be awarded to the man who caught the largest trout. More often than not, Bill Wheeler would be the man coming home wearing the belt. Wheeler's fishing party would also ship the fish they caught back to their friends in Malone. On one such occasion, they sent 40 trout, each weighing between a fourth and 11 pounds, to the staff of the Malone Palladium in a box packed with ice and wild moss. In addition to the Upper and Lower Saranac Lakes, favored fishing spots for Wheeler's Saranac Navigation Company included Racket Lake, Blue Mountain Lake, Follinsby Pond, Tupper Lake, and Big Wolf Pond. The anglers rarely followed a predetermined itinerary because, as one of them put it, "Wherever the Spirit taketh Bill, thither shall we go." When they returned home after a week or more of trout fishing, reporters described them as tough and healthy. Wheeler did not allow his work in Washington during his 5 terms as a congressman to interrupt his fishing expeditions. He arranged his congressional duties so that they would not conflict with his late May excursions. Wheeler even took time out from his bruising campaign to win election to the U.S. Senate in 1881 to go fishing in the Adirondacks. Bill Wheeler invited Lucy Hayes to go fishing with him as a way to thank her for the warm hospitality she and her husband had been extending to him at the White House. Touched by the fact that Wheeler had no children and that his wife Mary had died 3 months before the Hayes-Wheeler ticket had been nominated at the 1876 GOP National Convention in Cincinnati, Lucy and Rutherford had taken upon themselves to make Bill a member of their inner social circle at the White House. In the early spring of 1878, Bill asked Lucy if she would allow him to entertain her in the North Country by coming up to Malone and going with him on a fishing trip into the Adirondacks. Bill promised Lucy that the beauty of the mountains and the lakes would make the splendor of a White House reception pale in contrast. To his delight, Lucy accepted the invitation, and on Saturday, May 18th of 1878, the vice president stepped off the train in Malone, closely followed by the First Lady, her 8-year-old daughter Fanny, and a mutual friend, Mrs. John Woodworth. Carriages picked them up at the station and carried them the short distance up Elm Street to Wheeler's home, where they unpacked and began to make preparations for their fishing trip. After supper, the Malone Cornet Band and the Malone Glee Club marched over to the house and entertained Bill and his 3 guests. Wheeler's brick home was brilliantly illuminated, and a huge throng of people came to pay their respects to the Vice President and the First Lady. When they made their appearance on the veranda, prolonged applause and excited cheering greeted them. Bill thanked everyone for coming and gave a short speech praising Lucy as the true ideal of an American woman. When he was done, the Glee Club broke out with its rendition of the popular hit song Home Again, and a gigantic display of fireworks was set off. On Sunday, Bill took his guests to services at his church, the Malone Congregational Church. 2 days later, on May 21st, Wheeler led the 3 newest members of the Saranac Navigation Company south into the Adirondacks. They headed for the Prospect House on Upper Saranac Lake, where they made their headquarters. Bill hired one of the most popular Adirondack guides, Lucius Evans of Saranac Lake, to help them find the best fishing spots. At the end of the first day of fishing, Bill sent the president the largest trout they had caught. In no time, the telegraph wires between the White House and the Prospect House began to hum. Hayes jokingly telegraphed Wheeler that although the note accompanying the fish he had sent him said it weighed 13 pounds, Hayes thought it weighed more like 13 ounces. 2 days later, Bill wired Hayes that Lucy had just been crowned champion of the day because she had captured a deer swimming in the water that afternoon. On May 30th, Wheeler telegraphed the president that Lucy had caught a 15-pound salmon trout that he was sending to the White House. Calling Hayes a doubting Thomas because of his comment about the size of the last fish he had sent him, Bill's telegram urged Hayes to summon a coroner's jury to weigh the fish. When it arrived, Hayes was so impressed by the size of Lucy's catch that he served it to 4 of his cabinet members and several Republican House leaders as the main course at an informal dinner party. After shipping Lucy's prize fish to Washington, Wheeler and his guests left the Prospect House for an overnight stay at Paul Smith's luxurious resort hotel on Lower St. Regis Lake before returning to Malone. They brought 50 pounds of trout they had caught with them. The next day at noon, while they were traveling through Duane in their 4-horse coach on the road back to Malone from Paul Smith's, a heartwarming scene took place, which probably had been prearranged by Wheeler. As they drew near to a small schoolhouse, a dozen children came running out into the schoolyard waving American flags and formally bowing to the Vice President and the First Lady. Bill ordered the coach to stop, and he introduced the students and their teacher to Lucy. She spoke a few words to each of them and gave them all a warm hug before leaving. When Bill and Lucy arrived in Malone on Friday, May 31st, their 11-day fishing expedition into the Adirondacks came to an end. Lucy and Fanny spent the weekend and most of the following week recovering from their outing. On Thursday night, June 6th, Bill held an open house for Lucy. The next morning, he put Lucy and Fanny on a train for Washington. Soon after Lucy arrived at the White House, she wrote a note to Bill thanking him for a wild and joyous time. Wheeler replied that he too had greatly enjoyed himself. He told Lucy, "No one can commune with nature as we did without being happy and without being made every way better." A politician famous for his good character and high ideals? It's rare now, and it was rare back in the mid-19th century too. That might be one of the reasons why when William A. Wheeler was chosen as Rutherford B. Hayes' running mate in the election of 1876, not too many people had heard of him. As a famous story goes, when it was suggested to Rutherford B. Hayes that his running mate would end up being William Wheeler, the then governor wrote to his wife, I am ashamed to say, who is Wheeler? No one in the North Country of the time would say that. He was the New York Lincoln, a towering figure in business, one of the creators of the Adirondack and Niagara Falls State Parks, expander of civil rights, key founder of the modern Republican Party, and then the nation's 19th vice president. Yet he was humble and self-effacing. He a devoted husband and low-key power broker who let no ripple of scandal mar his reputation. This very lack of controversy might have contributed then and now to his low profile. At the age of 57, William Wheeler was a heartbeat away from the presidency. Rutherford B. Hayes had made a campaign promise to not run again, and he kept it. William Wheeler would have been a serious contender for the nomination, except political infighting had fractured his support in his home state of New York. Wheeler made private plans to run for the U.S. Senate instead, while not discouraging any presidential talk, which could only help his campaign. But his ambitions would not be realized. Vicious infighting among the party, a key suicide, and then President Garfield's assassination would all conspire to bring Wheeler's political career to a close. Declining health precluded him from being influential on the national stage again, and the end came in 1887 after a lingering illness. He was laid to rest in Malone, next to his beloved wife Mary. William Wheeler was one of a kind.